Al, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Daniel.
I'm really excited to talk about attendance today and improving school attendance. I know you, but for our audience and those who don't know you, could you give us just the quick intro on University Prep and then your role with the organization?
Absolutely. University Prep is a tuition-free public charter school in central Denver. We have currently 3 locations, 2 K-5 locations in kind of the north central Denver area, and a brand new school, which we've just opened just north of Denver in Adams 14, authorized by the Charter School Institute, which is our state authorizer here in Colorado. That's going to be a pre-K through 5th grade elementary school. We've opened just our pre-K classroom thus far, and we'll be adding a grade level to that each year from here on out. I'm the Chief Operating Officer. I'm in my 5th school year with University Prep. I joined from the private world as the Chief Operating Officer. I'm basically a bit of a jack of all trades, quite frankly. I oversee multiple functions within the network, including enrollment. I'm a quasi CFO. I support HR, recruitment, IT, to name but a few things.
Love it. Yeah.
Day-to-day school operations is another big bucket that I should probably mention.
Yeah, we had a lot of topics to pull from, essentially, is what you're saying for today's conversation. So let's frame the conversation a little bit. So,
sure.
This is not breaking news for anyone, but post COVID, it seems like chronic absenteeism, attendance issues has been really a theme, regardless of where you're at. Not localized to Denver or Colorado, but really across the nation. From your experience at a macro level, or maybe from what you know locally at UPrep, why do you think this has been such a challenge in kind of the post-COVID environment we're in? Maybe we can start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question to kind of set the scene. I think, I joined UPrep in May of 2020, which some people told me was a real choice. Being new to the organization at that time and then moving through the pandemic, what we realized was, and I think this is true at a very macro level, that relationships between families, home, and school were being severed. Yeah. Not being able to come into the school building was a challenge for families, and it really challenged teachers and administrators to be developing the sort of relationships and bonds that they had prior to the pandemic with families. And I think in addition to the severed relationships that we experienced, we redefined what school was across the nation, right? Prior to the pandemic, school was a building that everybody went to Monday through Friday. Every day we got out of bed, we hopped on the bus or jumped in the car or threw our backpack on and walked to school. But we went to a building and we greeted our teachers, and that's where we spent the day. During the pandemic, those lines became incredibly blurred as we dived into various types of remote learning, and whether it be asynchronous or synchronous learning, it all kind of redefined what school was for a lot of folks. Yeah, and I think all of that ultimately kind of, created a new set of conditions, a new set of rules by which, families and schools were operating in. And when we came back, once the quote unquote the pandemic ended, it's hard to kind of know what school then became. There was no definitive line. Okay, we're back now to kind of pre-pandemic school. We hoped we were.
Right.
But whether that actually was true or not, I think depended on who you spoke to.
Sure. Yeah, and I think for a lot of families, there was a sense of school is, depending on their experience during the pandemic, they may have decided this is a little bit optional. It's kind of like that Zoom class that they were logging into, some days was synchronous, some days was asynchronous. Therefore, we're going to kind of apply that same, sometimes we need to be there, sometimes we do work after hours to our life, and maybe families got accustomed to that. And then it is a bit of an abrupt pullback to, hey, we're in the building every day.
And a lot of the accountability mechanisms that were true before the pandemic, they went away during the pandemic. And so then it became questionable as to whether those were actually necessary or not.
Right.
I think as well, we sort of, we created a lot of confusion around, this how sick is too sick to be in school, pre-pandemic. And, I know I was guilty of this. My parents were guilty of this. If I had a sniffle or a cough, off to school you go. Don't don't worry about it.
Suck it up. You'll
Now,
be fine. Yep.
exactly right. Now, coming out of the pandemic, I think there's real question marks over, how sick is too sick to be in school, and that's further blurred some of the norms that we had pre-pandemic.
Okay, so give us the sort of pre and post, just in terms of attendance metrics or norms, because I think everyone, for others who are listening to this that are responsible for attendance or are paying attention to this KPI, sometimes this is localized in terms of what good is. Could you share a little bit about what you all observed just in terms of patterns, kind of pre-COVID, post-COVID?
Sure. I mean, pre-COVID, we were seeing average daily attendance up above, always consistently above 90%. Attendance certainly the norm would be above 92% as being kind of what we would regularly expect. In the years immediately post-pandemic, we were experiencing average daily attendance in mid to low 80%. And so a pretty dramatic drop for us, and something which really, shook us to our core, quite frankly.
I know we talked about the family perspective and kind of the sort of slingshot, if you will, of experiencing school outside the building and then coming back. From an operational perspective, like you alluded to some of the accountability structures no longer being in place, what do you feel like maybe in those immediately post-pandemic years were some of the biggest barriers to consistent attendance? Was it really mostly that family perspective, or do you feel like there were other kind of factors at play?
Well, I think the biggest factor at play was prior to the pandemic, our front office teams had deep and meaningful relationships with the families that walked through the door. Going through the pandemic and then immediately after the pandemic, those relationships really were not there, or the strength of those relationships was not there to fall back upon. And so pre-pandemic, you could really get away with, not necessarily having this sort of formal structure of protocols or escalations or supports in place, because one phone call from your receptionist to, grandma, mom, dad, whomever that relationship was, that says, hey, where is little Daniel this morning, would elicit the sort of response we wanted, because you definitely didn't want to disappoint Thelma, who was running the front desk, because you had a relationship with her and you desperately wanted to kind of, keep her happy. And so I think what we realized is we've been leaning on those relationships a lot, and without the depth of them, they weren't really eliciting the same sort of response that we had seen previously.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think maybe, to your point, easy to take for granted or take advantage of without having been placed into the context of those relationships being taken away, so to speak.
Sure.
As you all got back into recognizing that attendance was going to be an issue, one of the challenges with something like attendance is the metric itself can be very binary. Was the kid here? Yes or no? Did you all have any ways, and maybe we'll get into this as we talk about some of the things you all have done to really move the needle on this, but did you all have any ways of tracking kind of patterns or why attendance was an issue or problem areas, or was your sort of starting problem set just that, hey, we've gone from 92% plus down to kind of mid 80s?
I think that was our starting place. And initially we lent upon data that was housed in our student information system that was, quite frankly, pretty opaque. The data in the system, it all exists, but you've got to have the right access, you've got to have the time, you've got to have the will to extract the data to really then interrogate it. So you're 9 times out of 10, if you're a teacher looking at your classroom, you're one, anecdotally keeping track of heads in seats, and you're saying, okay, well, this week seemed a little like I had quite a few empty seats this week, versus, actually having the time to dig into the student information system and pull out percentages or track kids and their chronic absenteeism. And so there were 2 problems there, really. One is that, we were seeing, obviously, this data is there, but it's not really transparent enough. It's not accessible enough to the folks who need it on a daily basis. And it was dropping. Yeah. So there were really 2 things there. And there's, if you've got data that's really kind of tanking, and the only people who are really aware of that or able to see the day-by-day incremental decreases are the administrators, who, quite frankly, are not best positioned to do anything about it, you've got a real problem.
So totally agree. Tell us a little bit about the impetus to really prioritize making a change here. Where
Sure.
in the, because I think, at least in other conversations with leaders, there's a little bit of, well, time will sort of sort this out, right? We're only in year one after the kind of pandemic. Surely this bad data will sort of course correct. At what point did you all realize, no, we need to make a concerted effort around here in solving the problem you just identified? And what was that conversation like? Was that amongst you and others on the leadership team? Was that bubbled up by teachers? Maybe unpack that for us a little bit.
Sure. So I think really it was probably the summer of 2022. So we're sort of 2 years from the start of the pandemic. It's not really, I mean, I think there's still quite a lot of anxiety and fear at that point. But it was becoming very apparent to us that average daily attendance was a metric which was causing us quite a lot of grief and heartache. That year, the 22-23 school year, was one in which I would say we became acutely aware and started to really track in earnest how things were moving. And it became pretty apparent through the course of that school year that the wait and hope approach, can we rely on our old methodologies? Can we rely on these reigniting relationships with families and eliciting the sort of response that we want from them? Probably wasn't going to quite cut the mustard. And I distinctly remember we hold a quarterly retreat at the end of each quarter, and our final one is at the beginning of June, at the end of the school year, before we send our leadership team away for a couple of weeks just to rest and recuperate. Looking around the room as we talked about attendance and seeing a lot of very glum faces. And I can't remember who it is, and even if I could, I wouldn't throw them under the bus in such a public forum, but one of our leaders actually said, I just don't believe we can move this number. And I think that was an overwhelming belief in the room, was that it was a data point that was going to be really challenging for us to be able to influence. And I think that was the moment that myself and other senior leaders in the organization sort of, caught our breath, took a moment and thought, okay, we need to do something significantly different about this challenge.
Right. A moment of honesty or transparency can often prompt that. So where did you all start? Tell us about the approach you came up with. Step one, admitting you have a problem, right?
I think that's fair. Step one, admitting that we had a real problem. Step two, we were reading a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, which for those you listeners that are familiar with, they'll know it's an excellent book, which gives some incredibly tangible steps you can take to really focus in on I think what it calls your wildly important goals. And at University Prep, our mission is to equip every student that crosses our threshold with the knowledge, the skills, the character to prepare them for a 4-year college degree. And in fact, our very first core value is educate our scholars. And so we wanted to start with a set of lag measures that really articulated what academic success looked like for our kiddos. But then underneath that, we wanted to articulate some very specific lead measures that we could focus on every day that we knew would influence those lag measures, which ultimately would lead to the academic outcomes we were going after. And I think one of the things we'd historically had a challenge with at UPrep was being really specific about the goals we were going after. We'd had, campuses with differentiated goals and sort of varying degrees of well-articulated goals, but we wanted to get really clear as a network what really mattered most to us. And over that summer, we defined some really clear academic outcomes that we were going to go for. And then tied to that, 3 really clear lead measures that we were going to focus on. The first of which was attendance, because we said if kids aren't in seats, I had an old boss who used to say, if you haven't got bottoms in chairs, you're never going to do anything.
It's hard to learn if you're not there. That's certainly a prerequisite. Yeah.
That's a far more eloquent way of saying the same thing. But yes, being in school is a prerequisite for learning. And so with lead measure 1 being attendance, then we crafted a goal. We set ourselves a target that we were going to go after, and it was an ambitious goal. We wanted to get back up to sort of 92% plus. And then we started to think about the how. How are we going to actually achieve this goal? And, I think within the 4 disciplines of execution, it talks about setting a goal, having a plan, and then keeping a scorecard and a really visual scorecard on top of that. But we essentially that summer devised a plan which constituted some carrot, because we really wanted to get kids and families excited about coming back to school. And I'm hesitant to call it stick, but some protocols that could support families when they were struggling to meet the goal.
Okay, so I think most of our listeners will be familiar with the carrot and stick approach. Even if we don't like the term stick, I
Sure.
think the sentiment applies. So as you all are thinking about this, kind of clear metrics, clear scorecard, prioritizing attendance, it ties directly to the strategic goals of the organization. Tell us a little bit about the two sides of that coin. Maybe we can start with incentivizing families and getting them excited about being in school. What types of incentive programs did you all come up with? What was effective? What was not effective? Maybe we could start there.
Good question. So I think the first thing we wanted to do was create a really clear signal. Our ED referred to it as the bat signal. And we really wanted to signal to families very clearly what the goal was. No point having a goal if nobody knows what it is. And so we came up with somebody came up with a very catchy tagline, which was no more than 5 to thrive, no more than 5 absences to thrive in school. That was the underlying message. And we blasted that everywhere. We put that all over our social media. We put it on T-shirts. We sent out emails. We started the school year with a contract of commitment that I will commit to no more than 5 days of absence to thrive in school. And so the goal was just really clear to everybody. And what we said is there would be, for kids and for parents, there would be moments within the school year where we would celebrate you if you were on track for that. And so we set up a weekly incentive scheme for kids. So every week, if you were in school every day, Daniel, at the end of the week, you received a small prize. And those range from all sorts of things that kids love, not expensive things, but things like, Galaxy slime, or, light up yo-yos, or small Lego sets, really small things, but that, got kids kind of jazzed, I guess. And so we started doing that. We also started monthly attendance celebrations. And so if you missed 1 or fewer days of school, so 1 or 0 days of school within that month, at the end of the month, there was some sort of celebration that you could take part in. And our deans of operations at each of our campuses have taken responsibility for planning those. And there have been some really kind of joyful celebrations that have happened across our schools. We've had TikTok dance parties, we've had inflatable soccer stadiums come up. So we've had, pizza movie nights. They're a little bit more involved. They're a little bit bigger. The kids get to come out of class. They feel like they're being ingratiated into something quite special. But again, it's a monthly reminder that you want to be in school every day, because that's how you get to be a part of the TikTok dance party. And you can probably, most of your listeners will know from my sort of accent and how old I sound that I've got no idea what a TikTok dance party actually is. But I was told that it was very exciting.
But you're happy to provide the slime. You've got that going for you.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. And then the other side of that is we also wanted to acknowledge the role that parents played, right? Because, if you're a kindergartner, you can pester all you want, but there's a certain element of your mom or your dad or granny or granddad or whomever is at home is actually responsible for getting you to school. Right. And so at the end of our very first semester of doing this, we threw a celebratory breakfast for the families of those kids who'd achieved the goal. And it was an incredibly joyful moment. We served, I think, over 200 families with breakfast. They each got their own no more than 5 to thrive T-shirt, and a little kind of gift basket to say thank you. And it was a wonderful moment to actually sort of face to face say to parents that thank you for bringing your kid to school every day. It really matters to us. And here's your bacon as my way of saying thanks very much.
I love it. It certainly seems clear as you're describing this that one, obviously a lot of intentionality around we want to reinvigorate the excitement about coming to school. But what jumps out to me is it sounds like this effort really engaged a variety of stakeholders, everyone from the executive team prioritizing this to your deans of operations pulling off the pizza movie night, down to teachers who are in the classroom and have those relationships with students. How did you all think about getting collective sort of cultural buy-in? Because whenever you try to implement something like this, one of the challenges is making sure everyone's kind of on the same page. So, you mentioned having shared language about no more than 5 to thrive. Certainly really helpful in getting everyone to speaking the same language. Were there other things you noticed as you all tried to implement this and engage different stakeholders that you learned along the way that helped kind of make this a collective effort versus this is just a top-down initiative that I'm being told I need to do?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're lucky on two points here, I would say. One, we're a small network, right? We're a network of sort of 100 odd people from top to bottom and 3 schools. And then the second thing is we've got a wonderful chief academic officer who is just incredible when it comes to things like change management and PD and getting folks invested. And so she was really a leading force, I would say, in some of the messaging, specifically to our full network team. And then myself, our executive director, our deans of operations, we all layered on and played a role in that as well. But it really started with the why and being able to lean back on that lead and lag measure structure. We know that our number one core value at UPrep, I've already said this, is educate our scholars. And, we always framed everything that we talked about by way of attendance in terms of the impact on outcomes for students. And there is not a human being in our building who does not want the best outcomes for every single one of the kids in our building. And so a huge part of that change management was making sure that everything was grounded in our mission and our values, and that we were able to talk to it in terms of the tangible outcome for student learning, ultimately. We started with pre-service training, introducing this concept, really ensuring that shared language, as you said, around the attendance campaign was ingrained within everybody's understanding of lead measure 1, attendance, no more than 5 to thrive. What's the goal? How are we going to do this? What role do you play? And always reminding folks, and what are we doing all of this in service of?
Love it. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the carrot, multi-tiered incentive structure, making sure students are excited about coming to school, making sure that parents understand how passionate you all are about this, and thanking them for getting their scholars to school. Let's talk about the other side of the equation, because I'm sure listeners are thinking, yes, but you haven't met some of the families that we serve, and we try and they won't bring their kid to school, or there's this and that. And that's the reality, right, of this type of work. Could you tell us a little bit about the intervention, escalation framework that you all came up with and sort of how you arrived at some of those measures?
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to do so. So it starts with making sure not just that our staff and internal stakeholders have got the shared language of no more than 5 to thrive, but we wanted to make sure that families had that shared language as well. And so for us, it really began at registration that year, talking to families about what does no more than 5 to thrive mean? Well, it means you've got to come to school and you can miss no more than 5 days of school, and making sure that was really clear. We started with them with a contract of commitment, which clearly outlined what was involved, therefore, in meeting that goal, and asked parents and guardians and grandparents to sign that document to show that that was something that they were committed to. We shared with them as well at the start of the school year what our intervention and escalation system was if they started to struggle. So we were really transparent with them, with families, and said, okay, if you miss X numbers of days of school, this is what's going to happen. If it's Y, this is what's going to happen. And we'd made sure that we'd clearly articulated over the summer what that escalation protocol system was going to look like, who was going to be responsible for each action item on the protocol list. And so that was very clear. So it was very much, we had the system, we communicated it very transparently to parents. And then it was really about implementing it and following through, because it's all very well and good saying you're going to do something.
Right.
But to actually engender trust, you've then got to do the things. And I will say in our first year, we weren't perfect at this by any stretch of the imagination. And there were many times that we had to hold our hands up and say, that's on me. I actually didn't do the thing I said I would do. But in summary, we set out a list of escalation protocols that started with a phone call from your homeroom teacher. So you got to 3 absences, you got a phone call from the teacher. And we worked with teachers on what the language of that call should look like. It was very much about getting curious, understanding what was happening at home, if there was something getting in the way of getting to school. Oftentimes, teachers are so connected to families that they've often got a lot of this information as well. But the structure meant that there was always something to fall back on in the event that they didn't. So that was the first step. The second step thereafter was actually a phone call from one of the school leaders. So you might get a phone call from an assistant principal or the principal once you got to, let's say 5 absences, because whatever the challenge was that you were having at 3 absences has persisted. We know that school administrators have got a little bit more license to get creative with problem solving. Sometimes they've got a little bit more insight into the implications of the absences on the scholar, and they can speak a little bit more directly to that. And so that felt like the right intervention at that point. And also they can kind of run things up the flagpole if they need additional support. So they've got particular areas that are challenging. After that phone call, if you continued to find getting to school was a challenge, we'd actually go out to your home. We'd give you a call. We'd arrange a time to come visit.
And who's doing that? Who's knocking on the door? Is that teacher, principal, counselor, social worker? Who's actually out there in the field knocking on doors?
That's a great question. It's a real mix of people. Sometimes it's teachers. Sometimes it's the dean of operations. Sometimes it's part of our culture team. Sometimes it's an instructional leader. Sometimes it is the principal, depending on what their schedule looks like. Sometimes, Daniel, I've knocked on doors with folks. I tend to not go on my own because nobody knows who I am. But sometimes I've gone out there and done it as well, very, very rarely, and I should probably do it more often. But there are definitely, I think this is an area where a lot of folks have leaned in, especially our school leadership teams. And so our deans and our principals have leaned in heavily into this work. And that's a remarkable commitment from them because they have incredibly busy schedules, but they are in a position to fully leverage, the weight of their role and to get super curious, to build upon the conversations that have already happened, to get further creative with problem solving if necessary. Sometimes it's just about stressing how much we care that your child is in school. And sometimes you actually need to do that eyeball to eyeball. But that home visit was a real sort of a real kind of high leverage point in our escalation protocols.
Yeah, I can imagine that being powerful. I mean, even, like you said, even just from we really care about this and we're taking the time to come to your residence to tell you that. I mean, that's, like you said, that's not easily scalable. It requires someone's time, energy, and effort. Were there additional steps after that, or was that kind of the most aggressive intervention? And then after that, you're sort of talking about other measures?
Yeah, that was probably the most aggressive intervention that we got to. And then, we try not to get to the point where truancy has to kind of factor in.
Right.
And so we'll always try and do what we can to support a family before we have to get, outside agencies involved.
Sure. Makes sense. So on the one side, you've got sort of this multi-tiered incentive structure. On the other side, you've got this clearly communicated kind of escalation framework, and the two of these are working symbiotically. How did you all think about tracking? Because obviously you mentioned at the top of the conversation, having clear goals and making this a priority for the organization was key. But you also mentioned getting the SIS data was a headache. How did you all think about sort of pacing, tracking, measurable improvement? Did you see change quickly? Was it over a series of months, years? Tell us a little bit about that.
It was definitely over a series of months that we saw change. But to your point, one of the first things we had to do was get the information out of the SIS, because the information living in the student information system, it's not easily accessible. It's not always displayed, in the most easy to interpret manner.
Right.
And so we wanted to create a way of tracking this, a really visual and easy to interpret scoreboard for our folks. And so, I went about figuring out two things. One, what is the data we want to track? And then how do we extract that? And then creating, basically an in-house dashboard that allowed me to, and it's very rudimentary. I've not done anything particularly fancy here. It's CSV files, but, doing that in the back end of a Google Sheet with some really clear visuals that we track a few things. We track the average daily attendance of each grade level. We track where the numbers of students at each of the levels of our escalation protocols. We track the actions that have happened against the escalation protocols. And so we can see if there is a delta that is growing there between what we said we would do and what we actually have done. We also track in the same place, we track the exits of students. So any student attrition, so we can see whether there is a correlation between attendance and attrition of our students. And we do it all in the same document. So when I click the link, and we've encouraged everybody from,
I was just going to ask who has access to this, and like
literally everybody. Literally everybody in the organization has access to it. And so it's I try and encourage everybody to have it on one of their Google tabs that opens, when they open their browser every morning, so they can see, if I'm a teacher, I can see how many kids do I have at 3 absences, 5 absences, 7 absences? What's my ADA looking like? How's my grade level attrition looking for the year? So I can start to see trends. We created a level of detail for grade levels as well, so they could track individual scholars, and they could track their actions against those items as well. And then on a weekly basis, I try to make sure that I'm reporting out how our actions are matching what we said we would do. School leaders can see what deltas are occurring between, well, we said at 3, every teacher was going to make a phone call to a family. I can see in this grade level, they're on track. They've called, they've got a 1-to-1 correlation between calls and calls necessary. But I can see in this other grade level, we've got a delta of 5 there. And so we've got a little bit of catching up to do.
So what was the bell curve on improvement? You mentioned it took a number of months to see, measurable gains. Where did you feel like you hit, some sort of tipping point where you started to see, the meter, if you will, start to move back towards that 90% plus?
Yeah, I think towards the end of the very first semester of implementing this. So we're now sort of in our 4th semester.
Okay.
Of implementing this process. And through the first semester, we were certainly starting to see that there were gains being made. And that was incredibly encouraging. And it wasn't just gains. What was interesting was it wasn't just gains in average daily attendance. We saw huge increases on time attendance as well. And that was massive for us, because so much happens in the first hour of the school day.
Right.
That if if school starts at 7:45 and you're not showing up until 9 a.m., you're missing some core content. And actually, that's often when, tiny brains are at their most dangerous in the best way possible. And so, we really we pushed that home as well. We saw a 4%. So we've seen a 4% increase in our average daily attendance as we started doing this work across all of our schools and grade levels. And I think we've seen a sort of an 18% increase in our on-time percentage as well.
Yeah, and I think, I would imagine that's encouraging also for the staff that are participating in this, to see that, we're not just going through the motions here. This is having a measurable impact on students and scholars making it to school. As you reflect on this, you mentioned I think you said you're in your 4th semester. I would imagine along the way, there's been some learnings, and obviously you've laid out kind of the system and the process that you all implemented. What advice would you give other leaders who have identified attendance absenteeism as an issue within their organization? Any encouragements? This could be sort of broad strokes recommendations, or super micro kind of tactical stuff.
I think the systematic approach that we took, actually, we were very lucky in that it landed pretty quickly. And so having a really well articulated goal, being really specific about that goal, and not having too many goals, which was our historical misstep. And so really nailing ourselves down to 3 lead measures, with attendance being number 1, I think that was a learning which we really kind of got at a very opportune moment, because I think historically we'd have just way too many goals. There's far too many things to focus on when you're running schools. And so getting really clear about what your goal is, and if attendance is the thing you want to go after, being really specific and unabashed at kind of promoting that, I would say. And then I think tracking it to the nth degree is the other thing. The really visual scorecard has been just a huge level up for us in terms of people talking about attendance, people knowing where their schools are, people knowing what their grade level ADA is. It's been a huge cultural shift, I would say, in how we talk about that. In terms of sort of small tactical things, there have been iterations that we've made over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years. What we realized, I think, halfway through this, we were making everything really transparent and visual for our staff, but not so much so for the kids. And so we started implementing, trackers for children in their grade level so they could see, am I on track to win the incentive?
Right.
And it wasn't just this sort of, this at the end of the month, did I get it? Did I not get it? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's been an iteration. I think we've made small tactical tweaks around what prizes we give out, when we give them out. We've also made small tweaks to kind of the different levels of those interventions and when they occur. And I believe that is something that we will continue to iterate as we learn and we understand the capacity of our teams and teams change. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, I'm glad you hit on the, continuing to sort of refine the process, because that was going to be one of my last questions as we come to a wrap here is just, now that there has been a cultural shift, it sort of begs the question, how do you maintain momentum? How do you continue to build on what you've already established? Sort of the old adage, what got you here isn't going to get you there type of thing. And so I wanted to ask if you all are continuing to think about, what do attendance incentives, structures, efforts look like, in semester 20 and not in semester 4. Have you all thought at all about that? Or do you feel like you're kind of taking it semester by semester and sort of iterating based on observations?
I think there's a little bit of iterating based upon observations. I think our next big step in this bucket of work is to really focus on how we're onboarding new students. Families who are returning each year now are well versed in the 5 to Thrive campaign. They understand the expectation, and for the most part, they're doing a lot to meet it. What we want to really focus on, especially with our incoming kindergarten classes each year, is how do you onboard somebody effectively so that they fully understand, the mission of the school, they understand the expectations,
right?
And they're really bought in that this is what they want to do. And so for us, that's kind of our version 2.0 now. Is we will continue, I think, to iterate and work with our teams to understand how we can continue to build capacity of teams, how we can continue to iterate the protocols or what is and isn't working about the incentive structures, but making sure that we continue to, I think, evolving our onboarding process is our next step.
Awesome. All right. Well, I always ask everyone this before we wrap. Any resources or related items that you've found particularly beneficial or helpful as you've engaged in this work? Could be books, tools, other podcasts, recommended resources from fellow school leaders. Anything we can link in the show notes that you think might be relevant?
Sure. Well, I think The 4 Disciplines of Execution, which was a book that we read the summer that we decided to kind of, put all of this together, is a fabulous book with some really, really key learnings that we took, which I'd recommend to anybody read. So that would be top of the list, quite frankly.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll link to that. Al, this was great. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing about your experience. And I know there was lots in there that others can potentially apply to their own context. So I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. And like you said, I hope that somebody can take a nugget out of something I've shared.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.